Why does Tony Soprano react to other people's happiness like it's a personal insult? Why does a harmless laugh from Paulie Walnuts flip a switch in his brain? Watch Tony long enough and a pattern emerges. He can't stand joy unless he's the one creating it, controlling it, or crushing it. And nowhere is that clearer than in Miami, where Paulie's simple chuckle becomes the spark that reveals something darker. Tony's absolute intolerance for anyone who manages to be content within a 5-foot radius of him. Because in Tony's world, happiness is suspicious, joy is dangerous. And the moment someone like Paulie starts laughing at a sitcom or enjoying a plate of nachos, Tony doesn't see a friend relaxing. He sees a liability, a mockery, and a reminder of everything he can't stand about himself. Miami wasn't a vacation. It was Tony dragging a mirror around with him, forced to stare at the one thing he hates more than betrayal, the possibility that someone else might be genuinely, effortlessly happy. And the more Paulie smiles, the more Tony remembers why this annoyance cuts so deep. Because it exposes the truth he spends the entire series running from. So let's break down exactly why Tony treats happiness like a threat, and why Paulie's joy nearly gets him killed. Tony Soprano's Miami excursion with Paulie Walnuts is often remembered as a sun-drenched vacation, marred by Tony's increasingly volcanic irritation. An irritation so thick, it could have been scooped with a beach shovel. The question of why Tony becomes so agitated by Paulie's every breath, every chuckle, every anecdote, every ill-timed memory, has lingered for years, despite the fact that the clues are practically strobing across the screen in neon. Tony's problem in Miami is not simply Paulie's grating or his unfiltered conversational habits. The problem is Tony himself, a man who treats inner peace as though it owes him money. Happiness in Tony's world is either suspicious, inconvenient, or offensive, depending on the hour. He takes personal affront at the sight of other people enjoying themselves. Paulie laughing at a sitcom in a hotel room becomes, through Tony's skewed moral lens, an existential indictment. How dare this man be happy, especially while being so categorically dim? This is the same Tony who recoils at his own family members' joy or self-improvement. A son chatting with friends online? An irritation. A sister making progress? An affront. A wise guy cracking up at Three's company? Grounds for banishment from the Garden of Eden. Tony's emotional circuitry, tangled as a box of Christmas lights, rejects any scenario in which genuine contentment exists within his radius. The Miami storyline is a culmination of threads long woven. Tony's unresolved trauma from Junior's assassination attempt, the slow collapse of his paternal archetypes, and the uncomfortable realization that the men he idolized in childhood are not legendary figures, but irritating, insecure relics. Paulie, unfortunately for himself, embodies all of it. He is a man from Tony's father's era, one of the last ghosts of a mythology Tony has outgrown but can't quite escape. It is no coincidence that the season shows Tony rejecting every father figure, mentor, and elder surrogate with increasing intensity. Paulie's stories from the old days do not reaffirm the legacy of Johnny Boy Soprano. Instead, they expose the embarrassing pettiness of that legacy. Paulie's tales of back in the day illuminate not grandeur, but small-time brutality propped up by nostalgia. What Tony once revered now appears tawdry, and he resents Paulie for reminding him. The lingering issue of the Ginny sack joke further feeds Tony's hostility. Though years have passed since Ralphie's infamous wisecrack about a 95-pound mole on Ginny's backside, the fallout was enormous. Families nearly went to war. Blood simmered. Tony has always suspected that Paulie whispered the joke into Johnny Sack's ear. Season 4 makes it clear that Tony identifies the culprit even without proof. But Miami provides the perfect setting for Tony to test the theory directly. Out on the water, with nothing but the ocean and a long history of betrayals at his back, he prods Paulie with increasingly pointed questions. It is a reenactment of the FBI grilling a suspect, except Tony is the interrogator, and Paulie is the longtime ally caught in the glare of the spotlight. Should Paulie crack, the trip ends with a splash and a bubble. But Paulie does not break. He denies, and denies again. That denial, paradoxically, is what keeps him alive. Tony does not value honesty. He values a soldier's ability to hold a lie until death. After all, Ralphie's apology to Johnny Sack nearly got them all killed. It was Ralph's concession, not the insult, that proved fatal. When Tony looks at Paulie and sees a man who can keep a story buried, he sees a quality that outweighs personal grievances. And grievances Tony has in abundance. Among them is the simple fact that Paulie annoys him. Paulie annoys nearly everyone, but Tony's patience for irritation is microscopic by this point in the series. The man is lonely, volatile, and perpetually dissatisfied. When Paulie approaches every stranger as though initiating a neighborhood watch meeting, Tony sees a liability. When Paulie blabs about old crimes in front of strangers, Tony sees a risk to the crew's safety. When Paulie reminisces about early hits involving Tony's father, Tony feels the rotted foundation of his own mythology shifting beneath him. The Willie Overalls story, Paulie recounting how Johnny Boy sent him to kill a bookie just after Tony was born, lands not as an anecdote, but as a psychological excavation. Tony, who has spent his life trying to decipher the contours of his father's approval, hears Paulie's memory as an unwelcome reminder of the emotional vacancy he inherited. The cruise to Miami, framed as a getaway, becomes a wandering eulogy to the man Tony thought his father was, and the man he discovered he had become. Paulie's ongoing closeness with New York further strains the relationship. The Ginny Sack leak is merely the most memorable example of Paulie passing information to Johnny Sack. There is also the HUD scheme, the property sale, and the persistent palm greasing that never seems to exclusively benefit Jersey. Paulie has repeatedly demonstrated that he is far too comfortable offering New York tidbits he has no business sharing. His flirtation with the idea of supporting Johnny Sack and a potential regime change only clarifies the issue. Paulie likes power, proximity to power, and the illusion of being indispensable. He is, fundamentally, a man who wants to be valued, even if it means selling small pieces of himself to the highest bidder. This is why debates over whether Paulie betrayed Tony at the end of the series have lingered so stubbornly. On one side sits the argument that Paulie is too dim, too loyal, or too emotionally dependent on Tony to ever orchestrate betrayal at such a level. On the other side rests the possibility that Paulie, survivor of the 1970s Colombo chaos, nostalgic acrobat of self-preservation, would absolutely trade Tony's safety for his own advancement. The series itself plants enough ambiguous glances, slow camera rests, and lingering expressions to tempt the theory forward. Paulie's pensive looks in the final episodes, held by the camera a beat longer than natural, suggest a man burdened by guilt, or at least contemplating the mathematics of survival. He stands tanning outside Satriale's during wartime with an ease that seems almost taunting. He is one of the only men from Johnny Boy's era still breathing without a scratch. The camera repeatedly shows him alone, safe, unbothered. In a show where physical placement is metaphor, Paulie's positioning speaks volumes. Furthermore, Paulie's opportunism has precedent. His reaction to the suggestion of giving tribute money to Carmela while Tony lay in a coma was revealing. Loyalty evaporated the moment financial inconvenience appeared. He searched desperately for any loophole to avoid contributing, right until Tony opened his eyes, at which point the theatrics of devotion resumed. His loyalty, such as it is, operates on a sliding scale that fluctuates with risk, reward, and weather conditions. Tony himself never fully trusts Paulie. His inner circle has always been composed of Christopher, Silvio, and eventually Bobby. Paulie is a reliable soldier, but never a confidant. Tony's instincts, usually clouded by ego but occasionally sharp, keep Paulie at arm's length. He knows Paulie could never be an equal. What bothers him is the suspicion that Paulie might someday attempt to act like one. The idea that Paulie could be manipulated by Butchie or any other New York figure is not implausible. Butchie, after all, is a strategist disguised as a street-level thug, a man who pushes Phil forward like a pawn while orchestrating the board behind him. His behavior during the final war, acting bewildered that Tony was not at the Bing during his own assassination attempt, reeks of feigned ignorance. Butchie is not incompetent enough to rely on guesswork when planning multiple coordinated hits. He wanted Tony gone and needed plausible deniability. A Jersey insider with a bit of resentment and a history of whispering into New York ears would be a valuable conduit. Whether Paulie served that purpose is unconfirmed. Whether Paulie was capable of it is undeniable. Tony's refusal to kill Paulie in Miami may appear sentimental on the surface, but sentiment is the least convincing explanation. Tony was not prevented by affection. He was prevented by consequences. After the Ralph Cifaretto debacle, Tony understood that unexplained disappearances of high-ranking men would destabilize the crew and intensify suspicion. Killing Paulie would not be a neat removal. It would be a neon sign flashing guilt. Even the death itself would be difficult to disguise, and Tony has never been the master criminal he imagines himself to be. The sight of him fingering a dagger in the hotel room suggests a man ready to commit the act, but the wheels of self-preservation spin faster than the impulse. The moment passes. Tony lives with Paulie not because he wants to, but because he must. The possibility that Paulie flipped on Tony at the series' end is a theory strengthened not by any singular moment, but by the cumulative weight of characterization. Paulie is a survivor first, a loyalist second, and a sentimentalist only when the weather is right. He has demonstrated time and again that self-preservation will outrank camaraderie. Even if he loved Tony, and he did in his own stunted way, that love would not override a threat to himself. Within this universe, betrayal is not a moral failing, it is a survival tactic. Christopher loved Adriana and still contributed to her death. Tony loved his cousin Tony Blundetto and still executed him to preserve strategic alliances. Love operates on a sliding scale of convenience, deferred until the moment it becomes strategically disadvantageous. Paulie, who survived mob wars, changing eras, and the gradual professionalization of crime, understands the arithmetic better than most. In fact, the Miami episode serves as an extended examination of that arithmetic. Tony, observing Paulie's behavior up close, his indiscreet conversations, his willingness to provoke strangers, his nostalgic blathering, begins to weigh the cost of keeping him alive against the benefits of removing him. What ultimately saves Paulie is not affection, nor even utility, but the realization that Paulie's stupidity is not corrosive enough to be disloyal. Paulie's loose tongue is often damaging, but it is rarely strategic. His leaks to Johnny Sack were born out of vanity, not malevolence. In Miami, Tony sees that Paulie cannot be trusted with discretion in the general sense, but he can be trusted to hold on to one very specific lie with a death grip. That alone makes Paulie valuable in a world where the federal government is the more dangerous adversary. Tony's interrogation on the boat is therefore not merely about the Ginny Sack incident. It is a general stress test of Paulie's psychological plumbing. Tony needs to know whether Paulie can withstand pressure from investigators, rivals, or anyone else trying to pry open Jersey's operations. Tony observes him, prods him, and attempts to loosen his resolve. Paulie does not budge. His denial is complete. He protects the lie because the lie protects him. In Tony's universe, that is the highest form of competence. Of course, all of this exists in a series that intentionally blurs the moral lines between loyalty and opportunism. The Sopranos repeatedly demonstrates that love and betrayal coexist in the same emotional real estate. It is not that these men do not feel affection. It is that affection is ornamental, secondary to various survival agendas. Paulie's respect for Tony, embodied in the portrait that once hung over his mantle, does not eliminate the possibility of treachery. It merely complicates it. Paulie is a man shaped by decades of violence, shifting alliances, and a personal history of having mated through the war by the skin of his nuts. That is not the backstory of a man who dies for sentiment. Even the small symbolic details suggest a sinister undercurrent, at least for those inclined to see one. The recurring motif of scissors as a symbol of bad luck, Rose warning at Adriana's bridal shower, various appearances throughout the series, returns when Paulie brings a box of barber scissors to Satrial's in the finale. Where did the scissors come from? Butchie's salon, naturally. Is it a coincidence? A symbolic wink? A narrative breadcrumb? In the Sopranos universe, symbols matter precisely because they are ambiguous. They invite interpretation without confirming intention. The idea that Paulie set Tony up is neither confirmed nor refuted by the text of the series, but it fits neatly within the thematic architecture. The camera's suspicious focus on him, his suspiciously untroubled presence during wartime, his survival instinct, his resentment, his fading loyalty, his history of leaks, all form a constellation that, while not definitive, is too coherent to dismiss outright. The cut to black invites speculation not simply about Tony's fate, but about the forces that may have conspired to bring him there. Paulie, who has always floated between loyal soldier and self-serving opportunist, lands squarely within that constellation. All of these tensions, betrayals, suspicions, and near murders illuminate the central truth of the Tony-Paulie relationship. It is a partnership held together not by trust, but by inertia. Tony cannot bring himself to eliminate Paulie, and Paulie cannot quite summon the courage, or perhaps the cunning, to eliminate Tony directly. They are two relics circling each other in a decaying orbit, bound together by shared history, mutual suspicion, and the uncomfortable awareness that one misstep could end everything. This is why the Miami storyline resonates so strongly. It encapsulates the slow rot of their relationship, the breakdown of the old guard, and the realization that the men Tony grew up idolizing were not carved from granite, but sculpted from crumbling plaster. The Miami sun exposes every crack. Every laugh Paulie emits becomes an indictment. Every anecdote becomes a challenge. Every memory becomes a lie Tony no longer wishes to believe. The broader world of Miami, the scams, the drugs, the gambling, the perpetual glow of corruption, is merely a backdrop for an internal drama that has been building for years. The family's interest in Miami, whether wet t-shirt contests, Cuban smuggling routes, stolen shampoo trailers, loan sharking, gambling operations, or whatever else the local ecosystem could sustain, are less important than Tony's internal landscape. Miami is a place of distraction, and Tony is incapable of being distracted. The show uses the city's glitzy moral emptiness to emphasize Tony's inability to relax, even in paradise. He is a man who brings his own storm clouds. In the end, whether Paulie betrayed Tony or merely lived long enough to seem like he might have, remains one of the show's intentionally unsolved riddles. What the series does insist upon is the fragile nature of trust within the criminal world. Loyalty is conditional. Affection is temporary. Survival is absolute. Paulie is the embodiment of this philosophy. Loyal until loyalty becomes a burden. Respectful until respect demands sacrifice. Affectionate until affection becomes dangerous. He is a man who survives by calculation. Whether those calculations ultimately produce Tony's downfall is left to interpretation. What is clear is that the Tony-Paulie relationship, built on decades of shared history, mutual irritation, and emotional ambiguity, was always teetering between destruction and necessity. Miami did not create the tension. It simply illuminated it under tropical sunlight. The result is one of the richest examinations of the decaying structure of mob loyalty ever portrayed. A reminder that nostalgia is a poor foundation, trust is a fragile currency, and survival is the only true creed in a world where even laughter can be grounds for suspicion. Subscribe